Okay, so getting right into it with this deep dive on America First, you sent over these excerpts from Fred Fleitz's book. And wow, he really doesn't hold back, does he? I mean, he comes out swinging, saying the world right now is basically in a pre-war situation.
Yeah, using the term pre-war definitely grabs your attention.
It does. And then on top of that, he's claiming America's power, globally has seriously tanked. It's a pretty bold way to start off a book, don't you think?
It is, and it's important to remember this is coming from his specific viewpoint. But to be fair, he does try to back it up. He points to what he calls hubris and ideology back in the 90s, basically arguing that they set the stage for this decline. One example that really jumped out at me, and I had to double check this, was his claim that a single Chinese shipyard, just one, can now outproduce the entire U.S. shipbuilding industry.
Wait, really?
That's what he says. And if that's true, that's a massive shift in, well, who's got the upper hand when it comes to naval power.
No kidding. And it's not just shipbuilding he's worried about. He also mentions hostile countries just casually flying over American airspace.
Right, and he seems really concerned about the U.S. defense industry, whether it can keep up with all these new technologies, hypersonic missiles, AI, that kind of thing.
It's like he's saying we're falling behind.
That's the sense you get. And then, of course, you've got the war in Ukraine, which he uses to paint this picture of a world that's, well, kind of teetering on the brink.
Yeah, not exactly a sunny outlook. So, with all this doom and gloom, where does this America First idea come in? Is he saying we should just, build a wall around the country and ignore everyone else?
Well, not quite. He sees America First as, the solution, the antidote to what he calls decades of, and I'm quoting here, misguided foreign policy.
Okay, so what does that actually mean?
Basically, he's advocating for a pretty fundamental shift in how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world. His big thing is prioritizing American interests. He says that should be the top priority, even if it means going against what international organizations or, our traditional allies might want.
So it's about putting America first, which, I mean, it's in the name, right? But it's not necessarily about, isolationism.
Exactly.
Mhm.
He's not saying the U.S. should go it alone completely. He still believes in having strong alliances, but there's a catch.
Let me guess. They have to pull their weight.
Exactly. He's big on burden sharing, especially within NATO. He's super critical of when he sees as unequal contributions, with the U.S. doing too much and others not stepping up.
Right, we're footing the bill while everyone else is, I don't know, taking a nap.
That's the gist of it. He actually uses securing the U.S.-Mexico border as an example of this whole prioritizing national interests idea. He compares Trump's approach to Biden's, and, well, he's pretty clear about which one he thinks worked better.
And he was pretty vocal about that at the time, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. He argues that a lot of Biden's policies have actually backfired and made us more dependent on other countries, which he links to things like energy dependence and, of course, inflation.
Right, because if you're reliant on someone else for your energy, they can kind of hold you hostage, right?
Exactly. He's basically saying that becoming more self-reliant, especially when it comes to things like energy, is crucial for national security. Can't fight a war if you're worried about where your next gallon of gas is coming from.
It makes sense when you put it like that. But, okay, it's all well and good to talk about principles and all that, but how did this America First approach actually play out in the real world? I mean, did it work? Did it blow up in everyone's faces?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Fleitz definitely thinks it worked, and he points to specific foreign policy decisions during the Trump administration as proof. One of the big ones he highlights is moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem.
Oh, wow, that was a huge deal, wasn't it?
Huge. It was one of those things that everyone said would cause total chaos, spark violence, all that. And it was definitely a big departure from decades of U.S. policy in the region.
It was like throwing a match on a powder keg, or at least that's what everyone was saying at the time.
Right. But Fleitz argues that, despite all the warnings, it didn't actually lead to all that unrest and violence that people were predicting. In fact, he presents it as this example of how sometimes challenging the status quo, going against the grain, can actually lead to positive results.
Interesting. So he's saying sometimes you have to take risks, even if everyone else thinks you're crazy.
That's how he sees it.
Hmm.
He contrasts this with a reported $50 billion investment plan for the Palestinians that was apparently rejected, suggesting a different approach might have been better received.
Yeah.
But that's just one example. He also talks about the Abraham Accords, the agreements that kind of normalize things between Israel and some of the Arab states. He portrays those as a major, major diplomatic victory.
Which is something a lot of people thought was impossible, right? Like they'd been trying to make peace in the Middle East for decades.
Exactly. And he argues that it only happened because the Trump administration was willing to, well, break the mold, ditch the traditional playbook for Middle East peacemaking and try something totally different. He says that's America First diplomacy in action. What do you think? Was it as groundbreaking as he makes it out to be?
That's a tough one. I mean, the Abraham Accords definitely shook things up in the region, but whether they actually moved the needle on long-term peace or if it was more about, serving specific national interests in the moment, well, that's something people are still debating.
Fair enough. So we've got the embassy move, the Abraham Accords, anything else?
He also spends quite a bit of time on North Korea. He claims that Trump's approach, that whole meeting with Kim Jong-un, all that, actually de-escalated things, brought tensions down. Then he compares it to the Biden administration's policies, which he says have basically led to a resurgence of North Korea launching missiles again. Well, they have been pretty active lately, haven't they?
They have, but, it's always tricky with North Korea. They're kind of a wild card. It's hard to say for sure whether their actions are a direct result of U.S. policy or if there's something else going on internally that we just don't have visibility on.
Good point. It's not like we can just pick up the phone and ask them.
Exactly. They're not exactly known for their transparency.
Okay, so we've covered the Middle East, we've talked about North Korea, but he also gets into the whole Iran nuclear deal, right?
He does. And yeah, he definitely doesn't mince words.
What's his take?
He calls pulling out of the deal a necessary evil, basically. He says it was the only way to counter what he sees as Iran's, not-so-secret plan to cause chaos in the region. Again, he comes back to this idea that American interests have to come first, even if it means ignoring international pressure or getting criticized, even by our allies.
So it's kind of a pattern here, a willingness to make big moves, even if they're controversial or make some people uncomfortable.
It's about challenging the status quo, even if it ruffles some feathers along the way. He's not afraid to shake things up a bit.
It sounds like a big part of this America First approach is a focus on military strength, which, makes sense given his background.
Right, you can definitely see his experience as a Green Beret coming through in his writing. He argues that the U.S. military has been stuck in this rut, fighting these counterinsurgency wars for too long, and that we've kind of lost sight of the bigger picture, the possibility of a major war with a country like China or Russia.
So he's saying we're not ready for a big fight.
That's the impression I got. He even draws a parallel to the lead-up to World War I, talking about how quickly military technology was advancing back then and how the U.S. needs to learn from that. He seems to be pushing for a significant increase in military spending, like a lot more money for the Pentagon.
And a shift back to preparing for a more traditional kind of war. Tanks, planes, that sort of thing.
Exactly. He calls it peer-on-peer war, which basically means conflict with another country that has similar military capabilities. And he's not just talking about land battles. He's talking about air, sea, space, even cyberspace. He seems to be saying we need to be ready for anything, anywhere.
It's kind of scary when you think about it, but you mentioned his time in Afghanistan. How does that play into all of this?
He actually talks about his experience there, arguing that trying to change other countries' political systems, trying to, impose democracy, has been a costly mistake.
So he's saying we should just stay out of it.
Well, not necessarily. But he seems to favor a more hands-off approach, focusing on clear, achievable objectives and using military force more strategically, only when absolutely necessary.
So less nation building, more, targeted strikes or something.
Something like that. He uses the example of defeating ISIS as a success story, where the U.S. had a clear mission, went in with overwhelming force, and got the job done.
So what you're saying is he's not afraid to use military force, but he wants to see it used more effectively.
Right, and he's not just focused on overseas conflicts either. He also dedicates a whole chapter to Homeland Security, which he co-authored with Chad Wolf, the former acting Secretary of Homeland Security.
Interesting. What did they focus on?
Big surprise, securing the U.S.-Mexico border. They spend a lot of time praising the Trump administration's policies, claiming they were super effective in reducing illegal immigration.
Which has been a hot-button issue for a while now.
Totally. And they're pretty critical of how the Biden administration has handled it. They call it, and I'm quoting here, the most vulnerable border security situation since 9/11, which is a pretty serious accusation.
Wow. What specifically are they saying about Biden's approach?
They claim it's led to record numbers of illegal crossings, and they argue that this directly undermines national security because, if you don't know who's entering the country, it's easier for terrorists or criminals to slip through the cracks.
So they're linking border security to the fight against terrorism.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. They also talk about the threat of domestic terrorism, homegrown extremism. They emphasize the need for a whole-of-government approach, which basically means it's not just the FBI or the CIA's problem. It involves everyone, communities, schools, even religious institutions.
So it's about addressing the root causes as much as it is about catching the bad guys after the fact.
Exactly. But they also stress the importance of doing all of this without infringing on people's civil liberties, which is a tricky balance to strike.
For sure. It's a tough line to walk. But we can't talk about national security these days without talking about cybersecurity, can we?
Definitely not. They dedicate a whole section to that, and they don't sugarcoat it. They talk about how vulnerable our critical infrastructure is. Things like power grids, water systems, financial institutions, all the things that keep the country running. And it's not just about some kid in their basement hacking anymore.
Now you've got nation states involved, right?
It's exactly. China, Russia, North Korea, they're all trying to hack into our systems, either to steal information, cause disruption, or even worse.
They seem particularly worried about China's capabilities in cyberspace.
They are. They see China as the biggest threat. Actually, not just in cyberspace, but overall. They argue that China has been aggressively expanding its cyber capabilities for years. And they're not just talking about espionage or stealing secrets. They're worried about China potentially shutting down our power grid, disrupting our financial markets, basically bringing the country to its knees with the push of a button.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
I know, right? But they're serious. They even go so far as to call for banning Chinese tech companies like Huawei and ZTE from selling equipment in the U.S., saying their products can't be trusted. They're worried about back doors, hidden ways for the Chinese government to spy on us.
That's pretty intense. And come to think of it, they seem to bring up China a lot.
They do. They see China as America's biggest adversary, not just militarily,
Right.
but also economically and ideologically.
So it's about more than just who has the bigger army or the most powerful weapons.
Right. They argue that China has been waging a kind of quiet war against the U.S. for decades, using unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and even cultural influence to undermine American power.
What do they mean by cultural influence?
They're worried about things like Confucius Institutes on college campuses, which are funded by the Chinese government, and they even bring up TikTok.
Wait, TikTok? The social media app?
I know, it sounds crazy, but they see it as a potential tool for propaganda and surveillance by the Chinese Communist Party.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. But okay, so they're clearly concerned about China, but what do they suggest we do about it?
They have a lot of ideas, and for starters, they want to see the U.S. get a lot tougher on trade. They argue that we've been way too lenient with China for too long, allowing them to get away with unfair trade practices that have cost American jobs and weakened our economy.
So they want to start a trade war with China.
They don't call it that, but they do advocate for something called strategic decoupling, which basically means reducing our economic dependence on China. They want to see American companies bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and find other sources for goods that we currently import from China.
So less reliance on China, more self-sufficiency for the U.S.
Exactly. They also want to see a stronger military presence in the Indo-Pacific region to counter China's growing influence there. They talk about strengthening alliances with countries like Japan, Australia, and India, basically building a coalition of democracies to contain China's ambitions.
It sounds like they're talking about a major shift in American foreign policy.
They are. They see the relationship with China as a competition for global dominance, and they're urging the U.S. to wake up and start taking it seriously.
And a big part of that is Taiwan.
Right, absolutely. They see Taiwan as ground zero in this rivalry between the U.S. and China. They're adamant that Taiwan's independence is crucial and that the U.S. needs to do everything it can to support Taiwan militarily and diplomatically.
Which is a pretty bold stance given China's claims over Taiwan.
It is. But they see it as a fight for democracy and freedom against authoritarianism, and they argue that if Taiwan falls, it would be a huge blow to U.S. credibility and embolden China to be even more aggressive in the region.
It's interesting because they frame a lot of these geopolitical issues as almost like ideological battles.
That's true. For them, it's not just about national interests, it's about values. They see the world as divided between freedom-loving democracies and authoritarian regimes, and they believe the U.S. has a moral obligation to lead the free world and stand up to tyranny wherever it rears its ugly head.
It's a very black and white view of the world.
It is. And they're not shy about painting China as the villain in this story.
And they don't seem particularly optimistic about where things stand right now.
You're right, they're pretty concerned about the trajectory of China's military buildup, especially their nuclear arsenal.
They even seem to suggest that the U.S. military, as it is now, might not be ready for a conflict with China.
Yeah, they're not exactly mincing words. They argue that the U.S. needs to make some serious changes, both in terms of military spending and strategy, if it wants to deter China from starting a war.
So what do they suggest? What can the U.S. do to counter China's growing military might?
Well, they have a lot of ideas, but one of the key ones is strengthening alliances with other countries in the region, particularly Japan, Australia, and India. They talk about the Quad, which is this informal security partnership between those four countries, as a potential model for how to contain China's influence.
So kind of like a modern-day NATO, but in the Pacific?
Exactly. They also talk about the need to secure critical supply chains, especially for things like rare earth elements.
Rare earth elements, what are those?
They're a group of minerals that are essential for all sorts of high-tech industries, including a lot of military applications.
So they're pretty important then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the problem is that China currently dominates the global supply chain for these elements. So they're basically arguing that the U.S. needs to find ways to reduce its dependence on China for these critical materials.
Otherwise, we're kind of at their mercy if things go south.
Exactly. They argue that a big part of America First is about making sure the U.S. is less reliant on potential adversaries and more self-sufficient.
Okay, so we've talked about China's military might and its economic influence, but they also bring up something else that's a little closer to home, right?
You're talking about Chinese influence within the U.S. itself.
Exactly. What are some of their concerns there?
Well, they bring up a bunch of different things. One that jumped out at me was their concern about Chinese companies buying up American farmland, especially near military bases. They also talk about the presence of Confucius institutes on college campuses, which they see as a way for the Chinese government to spread propaganda and stifle academic freedom. And then there's TikTok.
TikTok, seriously.
I know, it sounds kind of out there, but they're worried about how much data TikTok collects on its users and whether that data could be accessed by the Chinese government.
So they see it as a potential national security threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They even go so far as to suggest that the U.S. government should consider banning TikTok outright.
Wow. They really don't pull any punches, do they?
Nope. And it's not just China that they're worried about. They also spend quite a bit of time talking about Iran and the threat they believe it poses to U.S. interests in the Middle East.
Which, given Fleitz's background and intelligence, isn't all that surprising. How do they view the current situation with Iran?
They're very critical of the Biden administration's attempts to revive the Iran nuclear deal. They see that deal as a huge mistake, basically arguing that it gave Iran billions of dollars that they then used to fund terrorist groups and destabilize the region.
So what do they propose instead?
They're big proponents of the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration pursued, with the sanctions and the diplomatic isolation. They believe that's the only way to force Iran back to the negotiating table and get them to agree to a deal that actually addresses all of America's concerns.
Interesting. So for them, it's not about finding common ground or compromising. It's about forcing Iran to back down.
Pretty much. They see the Middle East as this incredibly volatile region where the U.S. needs to project strength and be willing to use hard power if necessary.
And they're very clear about who they see as America's allies in the region, right?
Absolutely. They repeatedly emphasize the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship, praising Trump's decisions to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
Which were both highly controversial moves at the time.
They were, but in their view, those were examples of Trump putting America first and not being afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant alienating some of our allies.
It's a pattern we've seen throughout this book, a willingness to break from the traditional way of doing things and chart a new course, even if it ruffles some feathers along the way.
Exactly. And it's not just about foreign policy either. They also dedicate quite a bit of space to domestic policy, particularly when it comes to things like energy and manufacturing.
Yeah, they're really big on this idea of having a strong industrial base here in the U.S. They say it's not just about jobs or the economy, it's about national security.
Because if we're reliant on other countries for essential goods like, say, medical supplies or computer chips, we're kind of vulnerable if those supply chains get disrupted, right?
Exactly. Like what happened during the pandemic, remember? Suddenly, everyone's worried about where their face masks are coming from, and it turns out a lot of it was made in China. They argue that having a strong manufacturing base here in the US is crucial, especially for industries related to defense.
So we're not reliant on, say, China for weapons or, I don't know, parts for fighter jets.
Right. It's all about self-sufficiency and reducing our dependence on potential adversaries. Okay, so they've laid out this whole America First vision with a strong military, a secure border, less reliance on China, the whole 9 yards. But to actually make all of this happen, you need strong leadership, right? I mean, someone who can really push this agenda forward.
They actually dedicate a whole chapter to the issue of leadership, and they're very clear that it's not enough to just have the right policies on paper. You need the right people in charge to make it a reality.
So who are these right people, according to them?
Well, they're pretty skeptical of career bureaucrats, the people who've been working in government for decades. They seem to prefer people with more real-world experience, maybe from the business world or the military.
People who are more likely to shake things up and challenge the status quo.
Exactly. They argue that a lot of these career government officials are too risk-averse, too wedded to the old ways of doing things. They want to see fresh blood, people who are willing to take risks and make tough decisions, even if they're not popular.
So it's not just about what you believe in, it's about having the guts to actually do it.
Pretty much. They argue that America First leadership is about being bold, being decisive, and always putting American interests first, even if it means making enemies along the way.
It's a pretty uncompromising vision, isn't it?
It is, and it's certainly not without its critics. There are plenty of people who would argue that this kind of go-it-alone approach is dangerous and counterproductive, that it will alienate our allies and make the world a more dangerous place.
Right, because if we're only looking out for ourselves, who's going to have our back when we need it?
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. But regardless of where you stand on these issues, I think it's important to understand the arguments being made by both sides. And I think this book does a good job of laying out the America First perspective, even if you don't agree with everything they're saying.
Absolutely. It's been a fascinating deep dive, to say the least. And I think it highlights just how important it is to engage with these big ideas about America's role in the world. Because ultimately, these aren't just abstract policy debates. They have real-world consequences for all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.